Kick off, and your talk is called Two Notions of Fundamentality.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for organizing, Nick and Jesper, and thanks to Jessica for attacking grounding and just prompting, the people here to organize a workshop on the topic. As you all know, one reason to be interested in grounding is that it helps us analyze other notions, or is supposed to be helping us other notions. And one of these other notions that grounding is supposed to illuminate is fundamentality. So my talk today is about how we might use the notion of grounding to define or to analyze fundamentality. It seems to me that when we talk about fundamentality, about things being fundamental, or facts being fundamental, which is what I'm going to focus on, I'll sort of leave aside questions about the fundamentality of objects or properties in this talk. It seems to me there are sort of two ideas, or maybe sort of two metaphors, at least, that might be guiding us. And I think it's useful to think about foundations sort of in a house, let's say. What's fundamental is like what's at the foundations. And it seems to me we can sort of characterize what the foundations are from above or from below. The foundations of the house can be sort of characterized from below as that, sort of looking at it from below, as that such that nothing is underneath it, right? That seems to be sort of reasonable for a stab. You're looking what's below, nothing, so it's fundamental. Another way to go is sort of look from above and say, well, the fundamental things in a house, or the fundamental bricks, let's say, are those such that everything rests on them. So if you look at it from above, looking at what's above. So that other characterization isn't really doesn't tell you whether a particular brick, let's say, is fundamental, but it sort of tells you something about what conditions some bricks collectively need to satisfy to count as fundamental. They need to be such that sort of they support everything. So what I want to do today is sort of to look at what happens if we try to run with these metaphors and then try to parlay them into precise definitions of grounding. And I want to ask, in particular, if we end up sort of at the same, and if we end up picking out the same property. So it seems to me we have two different concepts. One is, explained sort of from below, the other one from above, two different concepts, but they may pick out the same property, in that case, property of facts. And I want to ask today whether that's so. I'll talk also a little bit about supervenience. I will contrast grounding and supervenience along the way. So I want to sort of make the point, which you probably believe already. It's maybe sort of unnecessary to point out that I think supervenience isn't suitable to capture the notion of fundamentality. So this is one of the notions that grounding can plausibly capture, but supervenience can't. So I don't mean to say that supervenience doesn't have other uses. I think for some other purposes it's much superior than grounding, but for this one it's not. So I have a little bit of bookkeeping on the handout. People use different sort of notations, so just in the first section on the handout tell you how I'm going to write these things down. I already said that I'm talking about facts being fundamental, so I'm just taking it here, fundamentality, as a predicate, not as an operator, as in 3. So sort of 1 is the canonical, is the sort of, displays the grammar of fundamentality as I'm using it. Let's not talk about 2, we don't need that. Then I tell you how I'm using grounding. I'm not introducing a special symbol today, but I'm sort of using it as a two-place predicate, which is officially plural on the right, so it takes plurality of plural on the left. It takes plurality of facts on the left and one particular fact on the right. So in 4 you have expressed like gamma grounds F, which is a bit awkward, of course, because I'm actually using the singular in grounds, but I don't know how to do without awkwardness, so I'm just going with the awkwardness. So likewise, I sometimes treat the plurality as a set. I take it that would be eliminable. We could just consistently do it in terms of plural, but it would be really clumsy, and I'm not going to do it. So no ontological sort of scruples today for me. Okay, so how do we define fundamentality in terms of grounding? I said there are two ideas, from above, from below. From below, a very plausible way of cashing it out would be what I called a B, boldface B on the handout in section 2. And so F, fact, is fundamental if there is no gamma that grounds F. And just something more about notation. I sort of use boldface B here on the handout to for the definitions. What it says here, there's no gamma that grounds F, and I use the B in not boldface for the biconditional that follows from the definition. So B not boldface means F is fundamental if and only if there is no gamma that grounds F. So there are lots of people that say things like that. One thing that sort of found easily and put on the handout is a quote from Karen Bennett. She says, if A grounds B, then A is more fundamental than B, so not vice versa. And A is ungrounded if and only if it is fundamental, full stop, absolutely fundamental. So what she calls here absolutely fundamental is just what I call fundamental here. But lots of people say things like that. It seems to me to sort of the standard and obvious way how you would want to define fundamentality in terms of grounding. The fundamental is the ungrounded. So we want to make a few remarks about that definition. That B, notice this is now the not boldface. On its own, it does not entail, of course, that there are fundamental facts. It's just a definition. It just tells you what it takes for a fact to be fundamental. But it does entail that there are fundamental facts if you assume also in conjunction with the assumption that that grounding is well-founded. As you may know, there is some debate about grounding is well-founded, and it's a bit unclear how to formulate this properly, but there is a recent paper by Scott Dixon, which I think has the best proposal, which for defining the well-foundedness of grounding. I won't go into that, but if you take well-foundedness as defined by Dixon, then you get that together with B, you get the conclusion that there are fundamental facts. Without assuming that grounding is well-founded, you won't get it. Then it also has the consequence, of course, if there are fundamental facts, they won't ground each other. And that's, I think, related to a sort of third idea related to fundamentality. I already told you about the idea about nothing below it and the idea of supporting everything. And the third idea of about fundamentality that people have is that the fundamental things are sort of independent from each other. And I have a quote here from Jonathan Schaffer that expresses that. Again, we could find other quotes, presumably expressing similar ideas. Schaffer says the fundamental actual concrete objects, that's what he's talking about, should be freely recombinable, serving as independent units of being building blocks, as it were. Thus, each should be, in Hume's word, entirely loose and separate. Somewhat more precisely, a plurality of entities is freely recombinable if and only if any combination of ways that each entity can be individually is a way that a plurality can be collectively. If entities are metaphysically independent, then they should be modally unconstrained in recombination. So that definition of fundamentality, boldface B, doesn't give you exactly that. It doesn't give you that fundamental entities are modally unconstrained in recombination. It doesn't give it to you on its own, but if we also accept a sort of principle to the effect that there are no broad necessary connections, and if we understand the no broadness condition in terms of grounding, then sort of it leads to that modal recombination principle about fundamental existences. So one way to read the principle that there are no broad necessary connection would be to say that there's sort of no necessary connection that aren't underwritten by a grounding connection, where it's not completely obvious how that idea of a grounding connection underwriting a necessary connection is to be spelled out, but nonetheless it's sort of a plausible idea. And so if we have that, then boldface B would capture that third intuition about fundamentality. Okay, so these are a few comments about boldface B, the first proposed explication of fundamentality. I now sort of turn to this other idea of defining fundamentality from above rather than below. And here I have a quote by David Lewis. Remember, the idea is that the fundamental facts are such that they sort of together account for everything. So Lewis says in the Reduction of Mind, I hold as an a priori principle that every contingent truth must be made true somehow by the pattern of coinstantiation of fundamental properties and relations. The whole truth about the world, including the mental part of the world, supervenes on this pattern. If two possible worlds were exactly isomorphic in their patterns of coinstantiation of fundamental properties and relations, they would thereby be exactly alike simpliciter. So Lewis talks about the fundamental properties being a supervenience, fundamental facts being supervenience space for everything. So he takes the fundamental facts to be presumably these instantiations of fundamental properties and relations, and they form a supervenience basis. That's a part where I'm going to talk a little bit about supervenience. Then it's sort of plausible to require the supervenience space to be minimal. So one idea before people started talking about grounding that you might have heard is that, well, the fundamental facts need to be such that together they form a minimal supervenience space for everything. Now that's not going to work, and roughly speaking, the problem with this is that there are far too many minimal supervenience spaces for everything. So if we have, for example, if we assume that for every contingent proposition there corresponds a fact that may or may not obtain in the actual world, then one can actually show quite easily that every fact will belong to some minimal supervenience base for everything. So you get, it would be a sort of non-discriminating condition. Anyway, in this respect, I think grounding does offer us a lot more, and I think while it's sort of hopeless to capture this idea of fundamentality from above in the supervenience tradition, I think it can be done in the sort of grounding framework. And to do that, I want to introduce this idea of a grounding base in analogy to the familiar idea of a supervenience base. So a grounding base for some facts is it's just, a class. I said I'm not going to be sort of stickler about plurals, so it's going to be a class of facts such that in the class for which it's a grounding base, every member of that class is grounded by members of the first class. So I should say that again. I mean, the simple idea which won't work, which I will sort of qualify in a minute, would be that gamma is a grounding base for delta if every fact in delta is grounded by some facts in gamma. So that will be the first step, which I haven't put on the handout. So that, and then we would want to, we're interested in sort of a supervenience grounding base for everything, a universal grounding base, and that would be on that first proposal would be a class of facts such that every fact is grounded by some facts among them. Now that doesn't work if, as is widely assumed, facts don't ground themselves. So whenever you have, if there are facts that are not grounded, then that first proposal would lead to the result that there can't be a grounding base for everything. So that's why I have this slightly more complicated definition of a grounding base on the handout. Gamma is a grounding base for delta if for every f that belongs to delta but not to gamma. So that's the change from the first proposal. There are facts among the gamma that ground f. So that's how I propose to define this notion of a grounding base that's supposed to play the role that the notion of supervenience base has sometimes been thought to play. And the universal grounding base, as I said, is a grounding base for all facts. And then a first proposal about how to parlay this into a definition of fundamentality from above would be to A1, f belongs to some universal grounding base. That's sort of a non-starter. It doesn't work because every fact would be fundamental if we took that to be the definition of fundamentality. If you just take the class of all facts, that's going to be a grounding base, sort of trivially, because there won't be any f that that will be a universal grounding base, because everything is a grounding base for itself. Because if you put in gamma twice, gamma is a grounding base for gamma. If for every f that belongs to gamma but not to gamma, there won't be any such f, so it will be trivially satisfied. Anyway, so A1 is a non-starter, but so we could maybe use this idea of minimality again. Remember, it didn't really help with supervenience bases, because there will be many different minimal supervenience bases, but with grounding the situation is better. So we can prove quite easily, only assuming the strong irreflexivity of grounding and what I'm calling cut, which I put on the handout on page 1. I have strong irreflexivity and cut. So cut is just a sort of generalized version of transitivity. That's what it is. Maybe I should have called it transitivity, but anyway. Together, you can then easily prove that there is at most one minimal grounding base. So that's a nice feature. So there's only one minimal universal grounding base, I should say. So you don't have that sort of problem of the multiplicity of different minimal supervenience bases when you use grounding. So this suggests that we could define fundamentality from above with a A2. So f is fundamental if f belongs to some minimal universal grounding base. Now that's not obviously wrong, unlike A1, but I still think it's not a good suggestion, because the problem is, I talked about well-foundedness before. So if grounding is well-founded in the actual worlds, then presumably there are fundamental facts. If grounding is not well-founded in the actual world, generally speaking, then there won't be necessarily fundamental facts. But we could sort of imagine that there are some facts that are well-founded in the sense that, if you trace down the grounding shades downwards, it bottoms out. But some other facts are such that, if you sort of seek their grounds and you keep finding more and more grounds at a deeper level. So you could have a sort of mixed world where sometimes it goes down infinitely and sometimes it doesn't. Now, if that's intuitively things, it seems to me that if that's the case, then there should be some fundamental facts, but not every fact will be such that it's grounded by fundamental facts. But A2 doesn't allow that. So if the world is a sort of mixed world, then there won't be any minimal universal grounding base, and so there won't be any fundamental facts in that case. The remedy is not to talk about minimal grounding bases, but rather to move to the other condition A, which I sort of propose as the best explication of this idea of explicating fundamentality from above, which is that f belongs to every universal grounding base. Rather than saying it belongs to some minimal universal grounding base, we require that it belongs to every universal grounding base. So we drop minimality, but we sort of supervaluate, as it were, require it to belong to every grounding base. Now, so we have this sort of two different accounts, B and A. So it's now natural to ask how they're related, right? So I sort of try to independently come at them to some extent, but now how are they related? Before I take up that question, I want to disambiguate something in the formulation of grounding. That will be important in what's to come. So far I've talked about grounding sort of without making the distinction between partial grounding and full grounding, which is pretty important. So, and sort of standardly made in the grounding literature, people distinguish between partial grounds and full grounds. If you look at the locutions that are often offered as explicating grounding, like because or in virtue of, and so on and so forth, it's probably fair to say that most of the time when they're used by people, they don't actually sort of indicate a connection of full grounding. It's more some sort of partial grounding. So in terms of explanation, of which we will hear more about later on this workshop, I think it's the distinction can be understood as follows. So the full grounds are sort of supposed to provide a complete metaphysical explanation of what they're grounding, while a partial ground are partial grounds are supposed to provide a partial metaphysical explanation of what they're grounding. So, and I think we do have a grasp of this distinction between partial and full explanations, and often, and almost every time we have an explanation of anything sort of non-trivial. The world is very complex, so all our explanations almost always are partial, unfortunately. So it seems to me that certainly the way grounding is introduced, often the sort of examples point towards a partial grounding. But anyway, so I'm here. I want to just say that there is distinction between full grounding and partial grounding. I want to briefly, by way of clarification, explain what I don't take the distinction to be. So I want to contrast it with other distinctions. So the way I understood partial and full grounding is not as merely partial versus full grounding. So the way I'm using partial grounding, and this is certainly in line with what many other authors do, is partial grounding isn't merely partial grounding. So full grounds are automatically partial grounds too. Also, the distinction isn't the same as singular and plural grounding, because you can have a plurality of gammas that still only partially ground things, and you can have a singular ground that's a full ground. Maybe the existence of Socrates is a full ground for the existence of singleton Socrates, but it's still it's only singular. And also, it's different from the distinction between non-exclusive and exclusive grounding. So you can have two separate full grounds. So the fact that there is another ground doesn't make you a partial ground. Anyway, so that's, I think, sometimes partial ground is used in this sense of non-exclusive ground, I think, but that's not how I'm using it. Okay, now if we have this distinction between full and partial grounding, we can disambiguate these two definitions that I offered, B and A. And if we cash out grounds as full grounds, we get BF or AF. And if we take grounds to be partial grounding, we get BP and AP. So we had two definitions, kind of definitions, one from above, one from below, and now disambiguating, we get four. And I said it's now natural to ask what the relations are between them, and that's I have this diagram on page 4, which summarizes what the entailments are. So I just so these are all bold. That's important, because if you take the corresponding non-bold things, would look different. Anyway, so it turns out that it's very easy. It's easy to show that those two entail each other, AP and BP, and those AF and BF entail each other, and AP tells AF, BP and tells BF, and but we can't show what we can't show is that AFM tells AP and that BFM tells BP. If we could show any of either this or this, then we'd have shown all of them to be equivalent. So there's a little mistake on the handout on page 3 at the bottom. What I write is true, but it sort of violates some Gracian maxims. Second to last line, the bullet point, I say, given strong irreflexivity, P pin tells AP and BF and tells AF, it actually, you don't even need strong irreflexivity for that. It follows without that. And in the last line, you only need strong irreflexivity. You don't need strong asymmetry, which is, is a weaker condition. Equivalent in the presence of transitivity, but, I'm sort of trying to keep track of the assumptions I use, but then in that case, didn't quite get it right on the handout. Okay, so anyway, what interests me is the fact that they don't all turn out to be equivalent yet. However, there is sort of a standard view about partial grounding that entails immediately that they all become equivalent. What I call the orthodox view of partial groundings sort of would collapse all these distinctions. It would entail that they're all equivalent. So the orthodox view just defines partial grounding in terms of full grounding. So it's page 4 of the handout. So it takes that to be a definition. What I have here is a biconditional. F partially grounds G if F together with some other facts fully grounds G. And this has sort of two immediate, several consequences, but two I'm interested in. One is called supplementation. If gamma partially grounds F, then there is some delta such that gamma and delta together fully ground F. I call that supplementation. In analogy to a principle in mereology, which in mereology you get principles to the effect that if you have a thing and a proper part of the thing, then that proper part can't be the only proper part of the thing. There needs to be some sort of other proper part that's disjoint from it, from that given proper part. There's a various subtly different version of that idea. I think that's weak supplementation, what I just said. But anyway, it's a thing that, if you have something and a part of it, then there needs to be, as it were, a remainder, intuitively speaking. And that's a sort of supplementation, it's a sort of remainder principle. You can find a supplement that gets you a full ground. And so that's even weaker than supplementation. Another consequence is what I call dichotomy. If there is a gamma that partially grounds F, there is a delta that fully grounds F, which then follows from supplementation. I call it dichotomy because it will have the result that a fact is either fully grounded or not even partially grounded. So it would be in either of the two categories, rather than either fully grounded or partially grounded but not fully grounded, or not grounded at all. So rather than the three, you'd only have the two categories. So if you have dichotomy, then BF and BP, become equivalent. BF says there is no gamma that fully grounds F. BP says there is no gamma that partially grounds F. And if you have dichotomy, everything that's partially grounded is fully grounded. So the two just turn out to be equivalent. And so hence we have here this arrow, and then if we by the transitivity of entailment, we also have this one here. So they all become equivalent. Now what I want to do in the rest is sort of challenge that orthodox view. And if the orthodox view is wrong, and if in particular dichotomy is wrong, then maybe I want to suggest we end up with two different notions of fundamentality, and I think that would be interesting from my point of view. So I want to, in the remaining time, which is like how much, like 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about the discussion. We went for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I started at 12, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to give you very briefly an idea why I think we should challenge the orthodox view. I'm actually not the first one who sort of thought of problems for supplementation. There's a Kit Fine has a quote. He says in a paper where he distinguishes different notions of partial grounding. He says there is a natural partial notion of ground for which a partial ground need not always be part of a full ground. One might wish to say, for example, that the truth that A is a partial ground for knowledge that A, even though there is nothing one might add to A to obtain a strict full ground for knowledge that A, and as in the view of Williamson, knowledge and its limits. And so I think it's a very suggestive example. I don't think it can actually be sort of very convincingly fleshed out. Or at least I can't see how. Fine doesn't flesh it out. I tried, and I sort of didn't think it can be made to work. But it would be nice, of course, because it would be an actual counterexample. So I then tried to think of a, sort of a potential, possible, conceivable counterexample. And what I've been able to come up is this sort of a world where you have a determinable property, which I call Schmarch, which has sort of two values, positive and negative. And the labels are arbitrary. It's not like positive charge is more similar to positive growth or to positive charge than it is to negative growth or negative charge. And in that world, you have sort of laws that tell you when a complex thing, neurologically complex thing has Schmarch. Maybe it has Schmarch if it's composed of an even number of things, each one of which has a given fundamental property F, sort of fundamental by any lights, let's assume. But then there's no sort of, the laws don't tell you about the polarity, as it were. That's sort of not determined. So the micro composition of these molecules tell you whether they have Schmarch, but they don't, that they don't have any implications about the polarity. And it seems like in that situation, or at least, it might be possible to flesh out the situation in such a way that it might be possible to say that in that case, if you take some sort of molecule that has positive Schmarch, that will be partially grounded by its being composed of an even number of Fs. But in that case, there wouldn't be sort of a full ground of its having positive Schmarch, because that wouldn't sort of entail that it has positive rather than negative Schmarch. These facts about the composition. So anyway, if things like that are conceivable, then maybe we can make sense of this idea that we could have a partial grounding, even though we can't add anything. We can't add anything to turn the partial ground into a full ground, and then if that were so, if we persuaded by examples like that or by other considerations came to give up the orthodox view of partial grounding and to give up the dichotomy, then we would have these non-equivalent potential definientia for fundamentality, and then it seems like we might want can ask which one is better, which one gives us the notion of fundamentality, and it seems like the answer comes out differently depending on whether we're sort of have more the idea of defining it from below in mind, or the idea of defining it from above. It seems like if you have the, if you try to define fundamentality from below, the natural thing to say is something is fundamental if it's not even partially grounded, if it's really, if nothing is underneath it, as it were. So then the natural notion would be this one. While if we want to define fundamentality from above, it seems like, you have this idea that the fundamental facts together need to be able to account for everything. But there, what we mean is not just partially account, fully account for everything. So it seems to me when we have if that is our leading and guiding idea, then the relevant notion is that one here. And if dichotomy fails, there won't be equivalent. And so I would say that in this situation, we should distinguish two notions of fundamentality. Strong fundamentality here, and weak fundamentality here. So that's it.